Good morning. I'm Theo Brown with the McClendon Scholar Program. We're really pleased you're joining us for this program. We're going to begin in just a couple of minutes, but want to give just a little more time for people to all sign on. We have quite a lot of people who've registered for this program. We're delighted by that. We just want to make sure everyone is able to be part of it at the beginning. As we're waiting, I want to point out to you the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen there. We'll be using this later in the program, and I'll explain a little bit about that and how you can ask questions of our scholar today. But right now, I just want to use it in a slightly different way. If you were interested to hear sort of where people are tuning in from, I know many of you, most of you are probably in the Washington, D.C. immediate area, but we know there are others from around the country. Other parts of the region around here, not right in Washington, D.C. So if you take just a moment and just type in, particularly if you're not in the D.C. area, not right in Washington, where are you from? And I'm starting to see the responses of folks. Victoria is in Ontario, Canada. 2 or 3, several as we expected, right in the Maryland area. I see someone from North Reddington Beach, Florida. Oh my goodness, we have someone from Trinidad and Tobago. You can see some of these many responses. Look at this. Miami, Florida, El Paso. So delighted to have folks from around the country part of this. Stephanie in Chicago, Illinois. And my good friend Shell Gravy in Bowie, Maryland, I see is there. And it's wonderful to see this. This is one of the advantages, of course, of an online program instead of in person. We really can share this message with those of you from sort of all around the country. So thanks for that. I see a lot of others in the DC area, and in Indiana. Anyway, the list goes on. So it's quite a great array of folks joining us, and we really look forward to the program. So we're going to formally start in about another minute or two as people continue to come in. Again, we're delighted you're here and really looking forward to this program that'll start in about 2 minutes.
Good morning, and welcome to today's McClendon Scholar Lecture, Storytelling for Survival, Formative Stories of the Hebrew Bible. We're so glad that you have chosen to spend a portion of your morning with us. I'm Reverend Heather Shortledge, transitional pastor at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, an inclusive, justice-seeking community of faith. Now, ordinarily, we'd be meeting inside our sanctuary, located downtown where New York Avenue meets with 13th and H Street, about a block from the White House. But due to the pandemic, our leadership has prioritized the safety and well-being of all our guests, and thus we are gathering today online. Online gatherings are not quite the same. However, there are some advantages to not having to leave your living room, maneuver through traffic, or hunt for a parking spot. Today's lecture by special guest, Dr. Judy Fentress-Williams, is hosted by the McClendon Scholar Program. This Scholar in Residence program was established through the generosity of the late Reverend Jack McClendon, who served as an associate minister at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church for 34 years. Jack was passionate about both action and reflection. So this program that bears his name strives to engage scholars in the place where faith, intellect, and justice meet. Again, we are delighted that over 400 of you have joined us this morning. Before we begin, let's give thanks to God. Please pray with me. God before us and God behind us, God for us and God who is even God for those who seem to be against us. Our scriptures speak of your wonderful power, the ways in which you defeat death and the ways in which you give new life. Today, we bring to you the truth of our world, the painful truth of hunger and poverty, of need and abandonment and anxiety, the painful truth of hurt and dying. We look around or scan the headlines and the daily news threatens to undo us. Long lines of people filing for unemployment, rising COVID-19 hospitalizations, guidelines urging schools to reopen, troop surges to democratic cities. So we bid you, O God, to move and to act and to care and to intervene in this hurting world. And at the same time, to free us for the big things now to be learned and received and enacted here in this lecture. Give us the freedom this day to be amazed and to trust your way among us, even when our world seems closed to your future, especially when the world seems broken beyond repair. We praise you, future creating God. Amen. On behalf of the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, thank you for tuning in today. I'll now turn it over to the Executive Director of our McClendon Scholar Program, Theo Brown.
Thank you, Heather. Again, just a welcome to all of you. As Heather said, the purpose of the McClendon Scholar Program is to sponsor presentations by scholars and thought leaders so they can share their wisdom and insight about how the church can be more effective in our work in the world, particularly as it relates to the struggle for social justice. If you want to learn more about our past and future programs, I invite you to go to our website on the New York Avenue Church website. And I think we're going to share that website with you in the chat function. So it will come up in a moment and you can look that up. It's nyapc.org/McClendon-SIR, and we'll have that shared with you in a moment. Since its founding in 2006, we've had a wide array of wonderful programs with scholars and thought leaders across the country. From the first program in 2006 with the great biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann, and since that time, we've had notables such as James Cone and Taylor Branch and Brian Stevenson, Ellen Davis, Senator Chris Coons, Simone Campbell, E.J. Dionne, Raphael Warnock, Kelly Brown Douglas, many more. And you'll see those on the website and more information about past programs and future ones. So we're delighted today to add the name of Judy Fentress-Williams to that distinguished list, and are particularly thankful to have her for our first ever online program. I'm sure it will not be our last. We certainly plan to go back to in-person programs at some point, but we're also learning, as Heather said, there are a lot of advantages to online, and many of you are joining us from around the country, wouldn't be able to do that in person. So we certainly will be keeping some online programs, I'm sure, as we go into the future. Before I introduce Dr. Fentress-Williams, I want to say just a few things about the program and how it will work. In a few moments, Our scholar for the weekend will make a presentation titled Storytelling for Survival. After she finishes, our pastor, Heather Shortledge, who you met briefly a moment ago, is going to engage in a dialogue with Dr. Fentress-Williams about her talk. And they'll be side by side on the screen having a conversation, and we'll all get a chance to listen in. And then after that, we'll have some time at the end for all of you to use that Q&A function many of us looked at earlier, where you typed in where you're from. We'll be having an opportunity to use the Q&A function and ask your own questions. And I will look through them and pick out some to ask to continue the dialogue with Dr. Fentress-Williams. You'll notice on the Q&A function, as you look at it, if you ask a question, you'll see there's the like symbol there, the thumbs up symbol. So once we get to the Q&A portion a little later, you can look and see it, questions other people have asked. And maybe someone's already asked your question or you really like one, you just click like. And that'll help me to see, of the many questions coming in, which ones we really ought to be asking. So as Dr. Fentress-Williams makes her presentation here in a few moments, be thinking about questions, and you can even begin to type in questions during her talk, and then of course more questions if you want during the dialogue between her and Reverend Shortledge. Then after that, at the very end, we'll have a little information for you about some upcoming programs, including one I want to mention. We have 2 webinars scheduled, one at the end of August, one in early September, with James Foreman Jr. Many of you are familiar with his work as one of the leaders in criminal justice reform in the country. And he'll be talking on the topic of, after the protests, what do we do now? I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the very end. And then, of course, we'll close by 11:30, or I promise very close to it. Also, just to let you know, we're recording this. So if you want to go back later and watch some portion of it, we'll make that available to you later so you can look at it again at your leisure. All right, it's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Judy Fentress-Williams to you. Dr. Fentress-Williams describes herself as having a bivocational ministry in Alexandria, Virginia. I love that term, bivocational ministry, and it really fits our speaker. Her 2 vocations are, one, that she serves as professor of Old Testament at Virginia Theological Seminary, and at the same time is the senior assistant to the pastor for teaching and preaching at the historic Alfred Street Baptist Church. And I know we have many people associated with both Virginia Theological Seminary and Alfred Street Baptist Church here today. And I just want to say, again, welcome in particular to all of you. Dr. Fentress-Williams has an impressive educational background that helped prepare her for the wonderful work that she does. She received her PhD in Hebrew Bible from Yale University in 1999. Before that, she earned her Master of Divinity from the Divinity School at Yale. And then before that, her AB in English from Princeton University with certificates in African American Studies and American Studies. Prior to her appointment at Virginia Theological in 2002, she was a member of the faculty at Hartford Seminary as a professor of Hebrew Bible. Dr. Fentress-Williams' published work reflects her interest in a literary approach that highlights the multiple voices in Scripture. She has produced a very well-regarded commentary on the book of Ruth, the Abington Old Testament commentary, and has recently finished a new book entitled Holy Imagination, a literary and theological introduction to the whole Bible, which will be available later this year, and you can pre-order now on Amazon if you're interested. She's also the author of numerous other articles and commentaries on the Bible, and you can find a fuller list of her publications and academic writings on the Virginia Theological Seminary website. And I think we're sharing that link with you also now through the chat function. So you can see that under chat, and you can learn more about her if you want. In addition to her work at Virginia Theological Seminary and the Alfred Street Baptist Church. Judy is an active member of the Society of Biblical Literature. She serves on the advisory board for the Office of Religious Life at Princeton University. She is married to Kevin Williams, an MD, and they have 2 children, Samantha and Jacob. I'm delighted to present to you Dr. Judy Fentress-Williams, our McClendon Scholar for this weekend.
Good morning, everyone. I want to begin by expressing my gratitude to the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church for the invitation to be with you all on this morning. It is indeed an honor and a privilege to be a McClendon Scholar. And I want to thank every member of the planning team who has worked and is continuing to work right now to ensure that this lecture goes smoothly. I want to thank Reverend Dr. Heather Shortledge, and then the planning team, including Theo Brown, Kim Sesko, Joe Thierney, and Will Timmons. Thank you all for your hard work, and I want to thank all of you who have chosen to be with us this morning. Now, the title for this morning's lecture is Storytelling for Survival. The title of the lecture is inspired by an observation I made years ago while working on the book of Ruth. Now, I suppose you all know the story of Ruth, and I don't want to insult your intelligence, and I don't want to insult your Bible savvy. So if you would allow me just to make a few points so that everybody has the same point of reference, I will give you the Judy Fentress-Williams abbreviated version of the book of Ruth. The story begins with a lovely, well-situated family in Bethlehem of Judah. Suddenly, a famine comes, which leads to forced migration. The Israelites end up moving from home, and the family in this story ends up going to Moab. Now, the Israelites hate the Moabites. In fact, they have a carefully cultivated narrative around them that explains why the Moabites are supposed to be hated and avoided. We even have rules in the Bible that prohibit seeing to the well-being of these detestable people. And this is where the family in our story ends up. Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their 2 sons find their way to Moab, where Elimelech, Naomi's husband, dies. The sons, to add insult to injury, then marry Moabite wives, and shortly thereafter, they die. So within a very few verses, Naomi finds herself without a husband and without her sons in a foreign land. She is a widow who is vulnerable because widows had no means of visible support. And what every vulnerable woman needs in that situation is 2 more widows. So now Naomi finds herself on the way back to Bethlehem with these 2 Moabite daughters-in-law. She tries to send them back, and they resist, and she pushes back, and they resist, but eventually Orpah relents and returns home. Ruth is apparently even more stubborn than her sister, and not only refuses to leave Naomi, but binds herself to Naomi with a vow. They go back to the land, and Ruth gleans so that they can have food to eat. And in the process of doing so, she encounters a wealthy, distant relative by the name of Boaz. Through a series of encounters and events, Ruth and Boaz enter into what is called a levirate marriage. It's a practice that allows the closest eligible male relative to marry a widow for the purpose of offspring and the purpose of inheritance. Boaz redeems the inheritance of Naomi's deceased son, Ruth's deceased husband, and they have a son named Obed. Ruth finds herself an ancestress to the great King David. So within 4 short chapters, we go full circle from a well-established family that gets displaced by famine, finds themselves in Moab, losing almost everything, returning to Bethlehem, where everything is restored and the family line continues. While working on the story, I made the observation and conclusion that although Ruth is known as a story of faithfulness and a story of redemption, that the story has a very practical function as a story of survival. Ruth and Naomi, two childless widows, figure out how to survive extreme hardship and loss and end up with marriage and a son for Ruth that provides security for Ruth and Naomi. The account of this story teaches us about survival. And to the Jews that return to the land after exile, the book instructs us that survival may very well depend on unlikely partnerships. Remember, Naomi and Ruth are an unlikely pair. Naomi, a revered Israelite woman, Ruth coming from the despised Moabite people. The two are bound by a vow of fidelity to one another based on love. They are coupled and manless. In addition, Ruth tells us that survival may depend on unusual tactics. In order to survive, Ruth goes out to glean. And eventually, Naomi sends Ruth to the threshing floor for a nocturnal encounter with Boaz that leaves him highly motivated to marry her. At the end of the story, once everything is resolved, there is a genealogy. The genealogy is brief, but it serves several functions. It's proof of the family's continuation. The line of Ruth's deceased husband, Mahlon, will continue, and so will the family. The genealogy ties Ruth to King David, and in so doing, weaves the Moabite widow into the tapestry of the Bible's larger story that eventually will connect her with Jesus the Messiah in Matthew's gospel. And in that genealogy in Matthew, we see other examples that establish a pattern that ties survival to unusual tactics and unlikely characters. It reinforces our understanding that a genealogy is proof of endurance. The genealogy itself, then, is a survival story. So with that background in mind, I'd like to tell you another story. Now, this one is a family story, and it's a true story. It's a story I tell fairly often, so you may have heard it before, but I'm not going to apologize for repeating it because it is worth repeating. And I suspect that even if you've heard it before, there is something you will hear in it that is new. So the story is about my husband's grandfather, Milton Benjamin Flowers. Except that's not what his parents named him. You see, when my husband's grandfather was born, his parents named him M.B., the initials M.B. His parents were in the rural South. They worked hard, and they dreamed of the success that they saw in the United States. They wanted that for their children. And so, as was the case with many other folks who were in that similar situation, you will see that they gave their children aspirational names. You'll see from that generation people named Colonel and Prince and Queen and Leroy and Jewel. Parents, in naming their children, were assigning a dignity in a world that would offer their children very little of it. And so my husband's grandfather's parents named their child MB on analogy with the famous wealthy families like the Carnegies, whose children were referred to in the news by their initials. Milton Benjamin was MB until he joined the Army, when he and his cousin SW were told that they had to have a full name, that an initial wouldn't be enough. And so in that moment, they named themselves. My husband's grandfather, my children's great-grandfather, served in the Army and then married and had 7 children. He and his wife both worked hard in jobs that were available to them. And Milton had 3 jobs. He was a janitor at the school where his children attended, which made it really difficult for them to get into trouble. He had a garbage route, and he purchased and ran a farm. Milton and Rosa wanted their children to have a college education. And so when it was time for the oldest child to go to college, Grandpa went to the bank, confident in the collateral that his farm had, and applied for a loan, an educational loan, whereupon he was informed that Negroes were not eligible for educational loans. So he took that information and returned to the bank later and applied for a home improvement loan, which he was given because he had good credit and plenty of collateral. And so he used that money that he got from the bank to pay for the education for his first few children. And then when it was time for the next group to go through, he went back and got some more of a home improvement loan and sent the next few children to school. And he did it again until it was time for the very last child to go to college. When he went to the bank this last time, the banker looked at him and said, "Milton, what are you doing on that farm?" And that's when my grandfather, or my husband's grandfather, told him, "You wouldn't give me the money to educate my children. So I used the money you would give me for this land to invest in my family." Now, I tell this story a lot, but for the most part, I tell it to my children. I tell it to my children because I want them to know where they came from and who they are. I want them to know that that kind of resilience is in their DNA. And I hope that when they hear it again and again and again, that they understand that when they face difficult obstacles, they have the wherewithal to figure out some way to overcome. And I pray that when they hear it, they internalize the message that they should never let another human being diminish them and that their dreams are achievable. The story about Milton Benjamin is many things. It's a foundational story. It's an identity story. And you could easily classify it as an origin story. And it is most certainly a subversive story. That whole part about getting money for one thing and using it for another. But for our purposes today, I want us to focus on that story as a survival story. Like the story of Ruth, it involves unlikely partnerships and unusual tactics. And might I just add that even though I tell the story with great pride, technically it's not my story. He's not my ancestor. I tell it by someone who is not connected to Milton by blood, but by marriage. But I know that if I tell it enough times, it will eventually become mine. The story about Milton and the story about Ruth represent stories about family survival that cut across the range of meaning for the term survive. To survive first means just to stay alive, not to die. Second, survive can mean to live longer than someone else. We see this usage in an obituary, which when referring to the deceased may say at the end, he or she is survived by, and then name those relatives who still live. The third meaning of the word is to live or persist through difficult circumstances. So for our time together today, I want to reflect on this specific function of storytelling for survival. I believe that the act of storytelling is something that is central for all humans and that it serves many purposes and a multitude of functions. But I want to highlight some stories that, when engaged in dialogue with particular communities, reveal other dimensions. Let's just look at the two examples I've already used. Beneath these stories, which I hope when we come to the end cause us to smile, we also find deep trauma and suffering. Some of the worst parts of these two stories actually are shaped in such a way that one or two sentences or just a few words will carry decades or even centuries of suffering and trauma. When I tell the story of my husband's grandfather and say, in those days, they didn't offer educational loans to Negroes, that simple sentence carries decades of suffering and injustice. When Ruth begins, in the days when the judges ruled there was a famine in the land, the story is signaling catastrophic events, which no doubt will result in the deaths of many. My point here is that we must be aware that a storyteller exercises control over history by casting events in such a way to form and inform the audience. We as readers then must exercise our ability in choosing how we want to engage the text. When one reads the story of Ruth, the way that we engage that story has so much to do with the location of the reader in dialogue with the location of the text. One's ability to identify and interact with a story and read it as a survival story has everything to do with the reader's context. In other words, your ability to identify a story as a survivor story often is connected to your own innate need or desire to survive. My work is informed by two assumptions about the text. The first comes from my approach to scripture, which is a dialogic approach. I believe that fundamentally the Bible is in dialogue, that it comes to us from different sources over an extended period of time and a variety of locations. The oral and written stories were collected, used, preserved, and translated into what we now call Bible or book, which in reality is a collection of books, fragments, stories, poems, letters, wisdom, myth, history that preserve the story and identify a people of faith. The truth that the Bible has to yield to us is a dialogic one. What that means is that the truth of Scripture comes out of the conversation from these various elements and fragments. Dialogic truth is a truth that requires more than one consciousness. In other words, you can't have all the truth all by yourself. Dialogic truth is one that has a personal, embodied quality to it. You cannot separate your context or experience from your experience with truth. Dialogic truth does not fit easily into a system, but it is structured around events. And finally, dialogic truth is always open. The word that's translated here from Russian to explain this concept comes into English as unfinalizability. And I love this word. It's this understanding of truth that I believe fits in so nicely with Scripture, because it describes truth as something that is always opening up in front of us and never finished. With dialogic truth, we understand no one person gets it all, that this truth exists in and not outside of us. It's connected to experience and relationship. This understanding of truth is structured around events, and it has this quality of unfinalizability. In my use of dialogic criticism, I then am listening for all of the voices in the story, even the silences in the text, because we know that the Bible uses characters to communicate the truth. The Bible is also in dialogue with itself. Think about the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel, who both speak for God, but have two very different theological constructs. The truth is somewhere out of the truth comes somewhere out of the midst of that conversation. The Bible then, with all of these voices, invites us as the reader into dialogue. We bring our experience, context, and questions to the text, which adds yet another level of conversation. The second assumption I want to make has to do with the origins of the Old Testament itself. We know that the Bible consists of stories and traditions of God's people, but we must also keep in mind that it was the event of the Babylonian exile that gave the motivation to record the text in writing. The diaspora required that the traditions be preserved differently, and one reason we have the Old Testament is because of the trauma of exile. We are reminded by those who write in the area of trauma that although trauma studies are relatively new, the experience of trauma is not. What I'm trying to say here is that the Bible we have is in part a product of the trauma of the Israelites' experience in exile. And knowing that should have an impact on how we engage this text. We know that traumatic events will forever shape a people's identity. In fact, they are usually events that we describe with one or two words. When we say September 11th, we don't mean any old September 11th. We mean that one, the one that forever changed our identity as Americans. The names of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd are more than the names of individuals. They are flashpoints in our recent history that uncover parts of our story we would rather not see or own. So although I want to acknowledge that the Old Testament has traumatic origins, I also think we need to acknowledge that the people of Israel were a people who were victims of ongoing or chronic trauma. The trauma of being a nomadic people and then an enslaved people, and then after some time in their own land being taken out into exile, that all of those experiences contribute to the way they see themselves in the world. The experiences of ongoing oppression and insecurity inform a worldview, and I believe we can detect ways in which Israelite tradition keepers reflected and worked through some aspects of their trauma in the telling of their stories. Moreover, I think we can learn key tips for survival in an uncertain world. Perhaps another way of putting it is, what can we learn about survivor from the survivors? In order to read for survival, try to adjust your perspective. Let me give you an example. In the wake of the pandemic, I was asked to give a devotion for an online seminar. And so I invited the participants to reflect on the image of the ark for our devotion. I talked about the ark as a place of safety, and that for all of its blessings, it also had limitations, and then led them to re-envision the word sanctuary, and then to imagine new ways of thinking about sacred space. I thought it was a pretty good devotion, if I say so myself. And then Breonna Taylor was murdered. And somewhere around that time, the video footage of Ahmaud Arbery's murder surfaced, and then George Floyd. And in a very short period of time, the image of the ark changed for me. The ark went from being sanctuary to privilege. In the context of the pandemic, when I placed myself in that context, I was still employed, with my family safe at home and with steady income. And so I felt like I was in the ark. But in the wake of more Black lives snatched violently away, I found myself outside of the ark, and my theological directive changed. When it was just the pandemic, it was find rest and peace in the sanctuary. In the wake of more Black people being murdered, my theological directive changed to build more arks. No one should be excluded from safety and security. Now, I think both readings of the text are valid, but I want to point out that this is where dialogic criticism's assertion that dialogic truth has an embodied quality to it helps us out. The second experience of being outside caused me to look back on my earlier experiences and recognize I had always read the story of Noah's Ark from inside the ark, without giving thought to all of the people who were outside. Our experiences have a way of shaping what we look for and what we see in Scripture. So if that is the case, to what extent are we noticing the contexts from which Scripture's traditions come to us? And what might we find when we think about these stories for all they have to offer us as offering even more? And that more may be of use to us, and that more, that extra, may be of use to us in these days when every single one of us is trying to survive in at least one sense of the word. Some of us want to stay alive and not die. Some of us seek the injustice, some of us see the injustice and violence of our world and want to live long enough just to see change in our world. We want to survive long enough to outlive injustice. I'm reminded of the kinds of things I used to hear from older folks when I was a child, where they would express a desire just to live long enough to see change in our world, to survive injustice. And that third meaning that I think applies to all of us. We all need help just to endure. So now what I'd like to do is reflect briefly on a story that might give us some tips that might equip us in getting these characteristics and skills that we will need to survive. Remember that the stories of the Israelites were told in defiance of their experience. Sometimes their stories defied their experience. One of the ways we survive is to tell a story that pushes against our reality. The Israelite stories that are told for survival reassure and reaffirm humanity in its fullness and in its purpose. All the while that stories for survival can push against a reality, stories for survival also form and create safe space for those who need it. And finally, these stories engage our imagination. And perhaps the most important survival skill of all is our ability to imagine. Let me point out how this works in a story with which you are all familiar, the story of Moses. I'll call it Moses, the Early Years. And here is a brief summary. The Israelites found themselves at the end of Genesis in the land of Joseph because Joseph brought them there so that they could survive the famine. While there, the Israelites were, according to the Bible, they were multiplied and became extremely prolific. This is in fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham that their people would be plentiful and abundant. And what we learn in Exodus is that sometimes the fulfillment of God's promise results in new problems. And that results with a new Pharaoh who is threatened by the blessing of abundance that the Israelites have. The new Pharaoh enslaves Israel. And I want you to pay attention to the language here, because what's interesting is that whereas the Bible can also often be very sparse in details, that's not what happens in Genesis 1. Exodus 1. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Listen to this. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses, for Pharaoh, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed upon them. So there's a lot of space given to detailing the extent of this oppression and of their servitude. What comes next then is an edict from the king. The king makes a decision that all of the infant males are to be killed. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you act as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, she shall live." So the violence that happens early on in this story is not the enslavement of the people. The violence that happens first is the violence of othering these people. Regina Schwartz is a religion scholar who makes the case that before you can enslave another human being, before you can decide to kill children, before you can decide to kill anyone, you must first do the first act of violence, which is to make them other. So what happens in this story is that there is an othering of the Israelite people with this new Pharaoh that allows all of these other terrible things to happen. The reason I point this out then is because in the story of the Exodus, there is an underlying chronic trauma of not being fully human. Before any of these terrible things happen, something terrible has already been in place that's decided that whoever you all are over there, you are not worthy of all the rights and benefits. You are somehow not fully human. And so in these early stories, the stories are told to push against, in defiance of that reality, and at the same time to protect those who are in need. So let's talk a little bit about how that happens. So I'm going to use a couple of brief examples, and I'm going to talk quickly. So we know that the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, when you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him, but if it is a girl, she shall live. The next verse says, but the midwives feared God. The storyteller here posits two realities, Pharaoh's reality and God's reality. And the midwives feared God, and for that reason, they did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said, why have you done this? And why have you allowed the boys to live? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. And Pharaoh bought it, in part because he didn't know anything about what happened in women's circles, and because he's already operating under the assumption that the Hebrew women really are not like the Egyptian women. So in this story, we see two midwives whose ethnicity is unclear to us. It's not clear whether they are Egyptian or Hebrew. They are midwives to the Hebrews. But the story suggests they're also midwives to the Egyptians. They know something about the way Egyptian women give birth. They form an unlikely partnership and use unusual tactics to survive. And that story is in defiance to the reality that Pharaoh wants to establish. Look at another quick episode at the beginning of Exodus chapter 2. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him, and she plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Now, the point I want to highlight in this story is that when this woman saw her child, the text says, when she saw he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. I love this story, and I laugh and smile every time I hear it. Newborn babies do not always look beautiful. But what mother do you know who looks at that child and does not see a fine baby? There's something about this that's universal, but more importantly, the language here is echoing and highlighting something important. When she saw that child, ki tov, how good he was. That phrase, ki tov, reminds us that everyone who has been created is a part of God's creation. This is what motivates Moses' mother to work hard alongside Pharaoh's daughter to preserve the life of this child. Another unlikely partnership with unusual tactics. God's call, God's interaction in this story requires that we engage our imagination. What is it that we see in this story that shows us God working in peculiar ways? Other than what's modeled by the midwives and his birth mother and his adoptive mother, we see another strand. When Pharaoh's daughter sees the basket come down the river, so Moses' mother puts the baby in the basket comes down the river, it says that Pharaoh's daughter went out to bathe. She saw the basket and sent for it. She opened it, and when she saw the child, he was crying, and she took pity on him. She saw, she heard, and she took pity. Those three movements are the same movements that God uses to describe God's action. God says, when God calls Moses in Exodus chapter 3, I've seen my people, I've heard their cry. Indeed, I know their suffering. By identifying with Pharaoh's daughter, God is inviting us to engage our imagination and envisioning what God wants us to do. I believe these stories teach us the importance of story. And as I close, I want to make sure we understand how important our role is as purveyors of stories, purveyors and tellers of stories that are multi-voiced and have multiple perspectives and invite our imagination. These are stories that invite us to see the work of God in new and different ways. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, we find what we call one of the foundational texts of the Israelite people, known as the Shema, the command to love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our mind, with all of our strength, with all of our muchness. I think one of the most important elements of the Shema is the command to repeat the story to our children. There is so much on the line in our lives today. And so many of us are asking ourselves, what can we do? There is so much we can do. But one thing that all of us can do is tell the story. Tell the stories of our people, of our tradition, of our walk with God, which push up against the powers and principalities and institutions that seek to oppress others. We can tell stories in defiance of injustice and immorality. And we can tell stories in such a way that affirm our full humanity, every single one of us as children of God. That every person is Kitov. How good. As storytellers of survival, we will find ourselves in unlikely circumstances with unlikely partners. But we will be able to do that if we are facilitated by our imagination, which is fed and given new life as we tell these stories. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Judy Fentress-Williams, for your wise words today about subversive survival stories and about how we are in dialogue with the Bible, listening for all of the voices, even the silences. I'm excited that we get a chance to have some conversation and discussion, the two of us this morning. And my first question for you is about this new book that we've been hearing about. It comes out in November, which reading between the lines means you've been extraordinarily busy over the past several months getting that ready. But it is called Holy Imagination. And you used that word a lot in your presentation this morning. It's a literary introduction to the Bible. Tell us more about this new book.
I'm glad to. The title of the book, Holy Imagination, is inspired by terminology or language used in the African American preaching tradition. Preachers will often say, in my sanctified imagination. And that's when you know they're about to enter into a story and imagine themselves in that narrative and open it up for us. And I believe that our imagination is the most important theological tool we have when it comes to interpreting sacred texts. That these texts are imaginatively written and that they require we bring our imagination to the work of interpretation, which I think supports a literary use, a literary interpretation of texts.
That sounds a little bit like the Jewish Midrash, that
Yes.
sanctified imagination.
Yes, I think we suffer great because we don't spend enough time in the tradition that was given to us by the purveyors of this text, our Jewish sisters and brothers.
Yeah. Well, speaking about the text, I have to admit that I really admire scholars who are not afraid of the mess of the Bible. When I entered seminary, I seemed to meet all of those people who had it all figured out, who had all the answers, that were certain about what God was calling them to do. And I felt a little stranded, like, I don't know all of the answers to this. And the more I read the Bible, the more questions I had rather than answers. And so I wonder how you prepare your seminarians and your church members for the messiness of the Bible and the messiness of the world.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I'll start with my students. When I'm working with students in the Old Testament interpretation course, and I show them that we have different versions of one story or different strands, and they don't always agree, and I will ask them to resist the urge to fix it and just to sit with it. That we lose so much by making the Bible neat, and we don't recognize that the Bible is interested in us experiencing it. That's what allows it to be messy. That we get in there and let it do what it's going to do around and in and through us, knowing that the next time we come back, it will have changed. So I think there's more to get from the messiness than there is from ignoring it.
Yeah, and as Christians, I think oftentimes we want to or thrive on being the fixers, and making it better. And I hear that call to dwell in it, to sit with it, to be in the messiness.
Yeah.
I also think that in today's world, we are hungry for people to kind of swoop in and save us. And I have heard that you have an affinity for superheroes and how they intersect with theology. And so I'm curious, do you have a favorite superhero? And if so, why?
So that changes, just like my favorite Bible verse. It's a moving target. So on any given day, I have a different favorite Bible verse, and I have different favorite superheroes. And this is hard because I tend to be torn between Wonder Woman and Black Panther. So those are often at the top of my list. But I also like the anti-heroes. I love Iron Man for all of his humanity and all of his hubris and all of the mistakes that he makes. I think there's that rings so true for me with biblical characters who are very, very human, and God somehow manages to work through them. That's good news for me.
I love that anti-heroes, because so often we are naming our heroes the people that we look up to and admire. But I think we can also learn from the anti-heroes for the people who are more like us that don't always get it right.
Yeah.
So I love that. Just one last question. As trained theologians, I think we are often responsible for holding on to and holding up hope to the people who are tuning in and listening to us. In the current state of the world, you named so much of it in your lecture, but protest and pandemic, how do you hold on to hope? What does that look like?
I think I hold on to hope in two ways. One is in looking behind me, thinking about the folks who, like my husband's grandfather, who figured out under extreme difficulty how not only to survive, but how to have a family and preserve some level of dignity for themselves. I learned from that. I also take hope when I see my children, because I feel as though they and their generation are better than we are. They got some good from us in that they are not going to simply be satisfied with the status quo. They won't be satisfied if it's just themselves and their friends who are all right. They seem committed to fighting for the well-being of all of us. And that gives me tremendous hope. So when I go out and I stand in defiance, I stand with them and take my cues from them. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Judy Fentress-Williams. It's been great to be a colleague with you today, and I look forward to having you as part of our worship service tomorrow. And now I think we have some questions from our audience, so I will turn it back to Theo.
Yes, thank you, Judy and Heather, for that discussion. We want to just continue it with some questions that have come in, and I invite you to continue to add questions over the next few minutes, or like some particular ones if you want to do that. One question has come in from David Roderick, asking about if Bible stories can be endlessly reinterpreted based on readers' needs and experiences? How can we authoritatively reject a particular interpretation as being contrary to God's will? And he points out the example of how people have misused the Bible and, defended slavery through it and anti and pro. So what would you say about a guideline for that, doing that?
So I first want to say that's a loaded question because it says things like authoritatively reject. So there's a lot in that question. What I would say is that for starters, a dialogic approach to scripture is best utilized in a community. So that part of the problem we've had in the past with scripture is that a group of people who all looked the same and came from the same part of the world and had the same interest came out with the authoritative interpretation of the text. So I'm not advocating that everybody bring their own thing and try to beat everyone else over the head with it, but that we actually sit in a room together and from our different contexts engage the multiple possibilities in this text.
There's another question picking up on your comment that I liked so much about violence really begins with other people. I just thought that was, for me, a very helpful way of saying that. And there's a question about, to be an anti-racist in the US, how important is it to see everyone as a person and not other? And I guess that also includes those who we might see as racist. Maybe how do we keep from othering folks who we disagree with, and as we seek to be anti-racist?
Yeah. So this is our life's work. This is something we work on every day. I think it is a spiritual discipline. And I think that one of the most important things we can do is to be fully human ourselves so that we can then make room for others to be fully human. I think so much of the violence we do over and against others comes out of our own brokenness and our own lack of completeness.
Another question from Cheryl Saunders. I believe this is the Reverend Cheryl Saunders, who you probably know.
Yeah.
And she says, how can we use the concept of dialogical truth to facilitate change and reconciliation in this moment of reckoning brought to bear upon our nation in the wake of the death of George Floyd and others? And then she asked, do Black Lives matter to God? I think we know the answer to that probably is yes. But this whole idea of dialogical truth and in this moment we're in and the reckoning we're in around racial issues.
So when we think about dialogic truth as embodied truth, the murder of George Floyd is a powerful example. I think one of the reasons that there was such a tremendous response around that murder, and let's be clear, this is not the first man to die, as a result of police violence by any stretch of the imagination. But because of the courage of that young woman who taped it, we all experienced it. We were there. And so whether we want to or not, we cannot unsee what we saw. And I think that the opportunity to embody that moment is an example of the embodied nature of dialogic truth. It's real and it's true, and I was there. And so in some ways, I think that that incredibly painful and tragic event has created a shift, because now it's not something up here. People are dying unnecessarily. We were there for all 9 minutes of it. Yeah.
There's some questions about other stories in the Bible that people want you to comment on a little bit. There was a question about from someone at Christ Lutheran Church about could you speak to the story, to the Joseph story, as one of unusual partnerships? The phrase that I like. Speak to our engagement in this moment for the transformation of the country.
So the Joseph story has so many interesting elements, and I love that story. But let's remember that the beginnings of that story are rooted in a dysfunctional family system, where you have favorites and rival children who are the children of rival wives. And so we've got a whole generation of brokenness that then leads to brothers putting their own brother in a pit and selling him into slavery. So that's why I talk about this othering coming out of our own brokenness. And so Joseph is forced to form unlikely partnerships. Sometimes desperate situations will put us in close proximity and in partnership with people we never thought we would work with. And in so doing, we have the opportunity every now and then to recognize the full humanity in another. But remember, in that Joseph story, even as high up as he gets, the Egyptians don't eat with the Israelites. So you still have these divisions, but there is hope in that story.
You talked about how sometimes, of course, the Bible stories are in dialogue with themselves with somewhat different perspectives. And there's a question from Neil Morgan about, do you see the story of Ruth and perhaps Jonah, he says, as a rebuttal to the Ezra Nehemiah's demand to divorce foreign wives and send away their children? So talk a little about those different biblical stories and the different messages.
Yes, I absolutely do. Now, not everyone will agree with me, but I definitely believe that Ruth story is a response, a counter narrative to the story in Ezra Nehemiah, which is such a peculiar narrative there anyway, where the people are coming back and trying so hard to assert their identity. And look at this pattern. People have been away and they want to assert their identity, and they're not quite sure what that looks like. So they latch onto this thing. Well, it's, you know, the foreign wives and children. Send wives and children away. Which seems to me to cut right against some of the foundational commandments we have in the Old Testament. And then you get a story of Ruth where the survival of the people upon their return depends on a foreign wife. So I absolutely think that. And then with Jonah in my mind is clearly a satire that's making fun of someone, you know, it's okay for God to save me, but that just me and mine. Yeah.
There are a couple of other questions about other stories just in the Old Testament, wanting your reaction to them as there's this dialogue going on between the stories. My friend Marion Bennett from Metropolitan AME writes, I love this number story of the 5 daughters who changed the laws of inheritance.
Yes.
She says she never heard this story till Bill got it recently. And about the story, and then her question is, how do we get male preachers to tell the stories better of women in the Bible?
Well, here it is. Storytellers get to decide what stories they tell and how they tell them. The daughters of Zelophehad is one of the best stories in the Bible because they go to Moses and say, this isn't fair. Moses goes to God and God says the women are right. I don't know why every woman preacher doesn't preach that at least once a year, just on general principle. But beyond that, I would say when we tell the story of the Exodus and we don't tell the stories of the women who saved Moses, we are perpetuating a narrative that is not based in truth.
You have given several examples, of course, of stories of resilience and hope. Is there a particular story you want to recommend that we might find helpful given our environment sort of suffering in the mixture of the pandemic and all that's going on around social justice? You want to point to one you've mentioned, or is there a story of resilience you see or have thought of recently that you think is particularly helpful at this time?
No, I don't have a particular story. What I do like is, as I said, I have a different favorite almost every day. But one thing that is constant and consistent for me would be the use of Psalms of Lament. I think that lament Psalms get honest with God about what's wrong in the world, honest about how we feel. They're not attempting to be pious or holy. And they invite God to come in and do something. You mentioned that Walter Brueggemann was the first McClendon lecturer. And in one of his books, he says that call to action is also the means by which we make ourselves available to be agents of God for justice in the world. And I think that so much of what's happening in this world in our protests is that this is a public form of lament. We are grieved beyond words by what we've seen, and we need to do something about it.
Julia Joyce Dominic picked up on your concept of the arc story in your devotion, which meaning changed over time for you. And she says, how do you imagine building more arcs for sanctuary that don't become binary arcs? White church versus black church, gay, straight, etc. How can our arcs be arcs and still be inclusive?
Well, that's a great question. Hello, Julia. I think that, so let me just say what I should have said was a larger arc, and I said more arcs. I was trying to decide which way to go there. Maybe a larger arc. Maybe a larger arc.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Someone else who didn't share their name asked this question. A little preface: the Jewish story is one of leading from a vision, a sense of self and self-worth. In another way, it's an offense, play posture, versus a defense, play posture. I think this is important and is often not well conveyed in biblical dialogues. I heard it in your retelling of the story of Ruth. Can you reflect on this? How is Ruth taking a forward-leaning non-victim status, in your view?
So let me try to get that last part. How is Ruth
taking a forward-leaning,
okay,
non-victim status in your view, or forward-learning? It may be. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think that in what we see in chapter 1 is Ruth resisting Naomi's desire to put her where she belongs in this situation. What's the best thing? And so what we can discern from the text is that Ruth is motivated by her love for Naomi. And so think again about operating out of love as opposed to operating out of fear. That there's a courage that can come when we are motivated by our love for one another, that Ruth cares enough about Naomi that she will not kind of leave her to whatever might happen. She is committed to her. And I think that that is one of the ways that Ruth shows us that she is not a victim or acted upon. She takes that action.
Another question from Claretta McDaniel at Howard Divinity School. She's picking up on your opening story about MB, and I just asked, is there a specific biblical story to which you can relate MB's story?
Well, I mean, I originally tied it to the story of Ruth, because I think that what happens on that threshing floor with Ruth and Boaz is the same kind of unlikely tactic there, that Ruth gets on the threshing floor under the cover of darkness. She puts on a cloak. So there's all this kind of literally, cloak and daggers, cloak and darkness. And she has to wait so that no one can see her, and then go to Boaz and, uncover his feet, which are not his feet, and get him in a position where she can make this request of covering. So I think in that sense, you've got that same kind of dynamic in both stories.
Another question about the times we're in. We have time for one or two more here, and as we get near our end time. Similar to some other questions, Stephanie Hamlet says, thank you for speaking on survival and reminding us to reflect on our survival stories. How do we maintain in these times hope? How do we maintain hope in this time, recognizing our past struggles seem to continue all the way back to Emmett Till and through the names of so many we know who have suffered and been victims of violence in the Black community? How do we keep from losing hope?
Yeah. So I am encouraged because it's the same, but it's not the same. So one of the things that we learn in the Bible about multiple voices and repetition is that just because something happens again doesn't mean it's exactly the same. That every rotation has a slightly different nuance. And so what I am hopeful, I derive hope from the fact that I see more diverse crowds gathering. I see a lot of young people saying, this is not just about this person's death. This is about systems and institutions. I read a story about a young African-American woman who reached out to large corporations who were kind of putting their Black Lives Matter advertising out. And she said, what percentage of your business do you give to Black entrepreneurs? That just made my day. That I am observing that there are folks who understand that it's not, that there's so much more than the protest, and they're doing it. They're empowered to do it. They're doing it with boldness. And I want to see how far we go this time.
A related question sort of on the question of arcs and the general idea of security, sanctuary as a way of survival. And there's sort of a question about our faith congregations, which are still mostly segregated and racially or ethnically, culturally, and just should we work towards more diverse congregation? Is that a way to expand the arcs? Or is it more just cooperation? Say a little bit about that.
So let me answer that by telling a story. I think sometimes we get around our most difficult questions by telling a story. My parents were Baptist, and they left a Black Baptist church. My father had a falling out with the deacons. That's what it was all. That's what I've been told. And we joined almost all white Presbyterian church. There was one other Black family in addition to us, and there was one older woman named Mrs. Gardner, and she was the only person who got to say amen during the sermon because no one had the nerve to tell her that she shouldn't. And that was the church that formed me. And in that, I got really solid biblical teaching. I love the order and structure of the Presbyterian church. But when I became older, had a tremendous longing to be connected culturally. And so found myself visiting a number of different churches. I am currently and have been a member of the Alfred Street Baptist Church. And what I would say is that the music makes all the difference in the world for me personally, as someone who lives and operates in a world that is predominantly white. I like walking in a space where I don't stand out because of my color. Now, having said that, that's where I find myself. I know plenty of people who love God, who are committed to diverse worship experiences. I think the answer is not to say, okay, we love Jesus, we need to be diverse. I think the answer is to say, we love God, let's all try to be whole human beings and see how far that gets us. See what that leads to next.
Let me ask one final kind of question. It's kind of an interesting, again, comment from your lecture, but picking up on the reality we're dealing with now. Someone, Constance Todd, says, I draw a comparison to the midwives. Though their ethnicity is unknown, they refuse to kill the male babies.
Yeah.
And then saying, well, there are others now, sort of other than Blacks, who are putting their bodies in the front lines of today's Black Lives Matter protest. Just speak to this and how that impacts hope.
Yeah, I mean, that is hopeful. I've heard about the mothers out, standing against these police who are not necessarily police, but militia, who have been authorized to grab people and put them in unmarked cars. This is unheard of in our country. And so I am hopeful when I hear about mothers doing that. I think it makes sense that mothers do that because I expect more from mothers, I guess is what I want to say. I expect more from people who know what it is to hold life inside of them and to carry that and the responsibility there. So I am delighted. And I also want to say, and that is exactly where mothers should be. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Judy Fentress-Williams. We are near the end of our time and we need to draw to a close. In a moment, I'm going to ask Judy to just make one final comment, and I have a couple of announcements that I think will be of interest to you. and before we close here in a few minutes. I hope you've benefited from this lecture, learned a lot, been inspired. I know that I have been. I want to thank several people who helped do this program. Judy already mentioned our technical team of two of our members, Will Timmons and Joe Thierry. My colleague Kim Sesko helped us figure out all the computer glitches we ran into earlier in the week, and they have overcome them wonderfully. And also thanks to the McClendon Scholar Council at New York Avenue Presbyterian, group of 11 people who oversee our programs and help to plan them. And as I say, I have a couple of brief announcements that I will give here in just a moment about some future programs. In fact, something today some people may be interested in. But again, just before we do, Judy, I just want to say thank you again for your presentation, the wisdom in the comments. See if you have just a final word you want to leave with everyone here as we come to a close.
Sure. First, thank you again for the opportunity to share with you all today. I am a storyteller whose life has been shaped tremendously by story. And I want you to know that whether you know it or not, you too are a storyteller. And I hope that you take it upon yourselves to tell the story of a God who believes, who made us to be fully human. And it is God's desire that we live into our creatureliness. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope you will join us for future McClendon Scholar programs. Information about them again can be found on our website, which we're sharing again in chat. And here is also a slide that shows some upcoming programs. And in particular, as I mentioned earlier, we're excited to have James Foreman Jr. from Yale Law School, author of Locking Up Our Own, a book for which he won the Pulitzer Prize, talking about, all right, we've shown this concern in demonstrations and protests, and what do we do now for those of us at New York Avenue Church and other congregations we work with? So we'll have two different programs with him. We'll send out details, but these will be lively and exciting and focus as much as we can on how helping us all to get involved in more effective ways as we address the issues around that have been the source of so much protest recently in the country around racial equity and criminal justice reform, et cetera. So we'll be sending information soon about how to register for those programs. Two other quick final announcements. First of all, Dr. Fentress-Williams will be preaching tomorrow morning in the 10 o'clock online service. If you want to sneak out and not go to your church service online tomorrow and hear her preach, we'd be glad to have you join us at New York Avenue if you're not a New York Avenue member. And you can get the link to that service on our website. And that's www.nyapc.org. And you go on and it gives instructions, and that's at 10 o'clock. So if you want to hear her sermon, we'd be delighted to have you visit with us tomorrow during the online worship at New York Avenue Presbyterian. And second, and a final thing, we're having, it's a sort of a last minute announcement that may be of interest to some of you. We're having an informal discussion. Some members of New York Avenue are having an informal discussion with Dr. Fentress-Williams this afternoon at 1:30 on Zoom. It's just a small group of people, mainly to talk about congregational issues, learn more about what Alfred Street Church is doing around issues relating to the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement. And we still have a few slots available, 6 or 8. We're keeping it limited. But if you want to join this afternoon discussion, email me at this address. You should do it right away. We'll only be able to accept the first 6 or 8 who tune in, who email me, maybe up to 10. But we're, as I say, keeping it small so we can have a real conversation. So email me, again, Theo Brown, at that address. And the first several people who email me, I'll send you the link and for you to join us at it's a conversation from 1:30 to 2:30. So thank you very much again for your attendance, for your involvement, for your good questions. And thank you again to Dr. Judy Fentress-Williams, and goodbye today from this program. Thank you so much.